Hey there, and welcome back to Close Read. This is Aaron Huertas, and I really appreciate everybody who's stepped up to share ideas for the podcast with me and also for subscribing on Patreon. We also just got listed on iTunes, so if you want to throw us a review, I'll include a link there in the show notes. It would be deeply appreciated. It's a great way to get some more eyeballs and ears on the podcast. Today, I wanted to take a look at a very foundational concept in political communication, and that's called framing. The word framing gets thrown around a little willy-nilly. Sometimes people think of framing as messaging or framing as the sort of argument we have over what words we use in a political debate. And it does include some of that. I would say that messaging is tactical. It's what we're saying to try to win a news cycle, to respond to something rapidly in the moment. And it might be some slight tweaks to word choices, things that people argue about in focus groups and polls and stuff like that. Framing is a lot deeper. Framing is strategic. Framing is a fundamental communications choice we make about how we think about a problem and therefore how we think about solutions to a given problem. And I wanted to revisit this with the first person who challenged me to think really deeply about framing, and that's Peter Loge. He's a practitioner, he's a professor, he's a director of the Project on Ethics in Political Communication at the George Washington University. A really fascinating guy, has done a lot of work in this space. And I've been thinking about an example of his work that he often shared with us in class, and that was work he had done on the death penalty. And I'm thinking about it because so many of the conversations we're having right now in response to these incredible civil rights protests have been about abolition versus reform, right? What do you do with police departments? What do you do with prisons? And this crops up in a lot of other areas too, right? Abolishing ICE versus repealing and replacing ICE, or reforming ICE, or reforming immigration law. It also shows up a lot in the climate debate, right? Leave fossil fuels in the ground, stop extracting fossil fuels versus let's do a transition away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy. These are really, really deep framing choices. And in this conversation with Peter Loge, we'll get into what framing is. We'll go through a couple examples, and we'll spend most of our time talking about how this actually played out in the death penalty debate. And before we get into it, I wanted to revisit this historical example because for a lot of people, this is an extant issue. This is an ongoing debate, but this debate ran really hot for a while, right? And now there's more of a hot debate about policing and about abolition and police reform. And I wanted to use this historical example to show that, we don't know what the framing and communication answers are going to be in a given time period. But what we can do is look at the trade-offs that are involved in these choices that we make, particularly when it comes to centering the needs of communities that are on the front lines of these issues and when it comes to actually advancing justice. So just to take a quick look at the death penalty so you have this context, it's worth remembering that the U.S. is the only developed Western nation that still uses the death penalty with any regularity. Some states banned the death penalty as early as the 1800s, and at their peak, we had about 200 executions per year in the 1920s. That was the sort of peak of executions in the death penalty in the United States. There were a series of constitutional challenges in the 1970s that led to a de facto suspension of the death penalty. And that was, looking at the death penalty as a form of, quote, cruel and unusual, unquote, punishment, and also one that deprived defendants of their due process. Now, it would have been easy at that point for politicians to say, "Oh well, thanks, Supreme Court, you've fixed this for us. We don't have to do the death penalty anymore." But unfortunately, what happened was instead 37 states simply responded to those rulings with new laws that would meet some of these standards the Supreme Court had put out there. So by 2000, we had another 100 executions in a single year again. And this declined over time thanks to some of the work that we'll talk about, some of this reform-minded work that challenged the legal processes around the death penalty and got moratoria and got more states to revisit their death penalty laws. And, we should be clear. This is a racially motivated form of punishment. There are 2,620 people on death row, and there's incredible racial bias in who winds up on death row. More than 1,000 of the death row inmates, 42%, are African American. So these debates are ongoing. Washington State, New Hampshire, and Colorado, they abolished their death penalties in just the past 3 years. And as we think about framing and as we think about these current debates, it really is worth considering how advocates, communicators, strategists, how people who work in movements, how people work in big lobbying groups in DC, how they interact with each other, and how these framing choices play out in the real world. And I hope this examination of framing and these historical examples are useful for you as you think about some of these ongoing debates and how we're engaged in very active framing choices right now. Okay, great. So joining me now is Peter Loge. Hello, Peter.
Good morning. How are you doing?
Doing really well. I know you because I was your student, I guess more than a decade ago at this point, and you're still teaching people like me how to do political communication, and you're also a practitioner. So I wonder if you could just talk to us a little bit about your work and what you're up to now.
Sure, great. I can't. It's been over a decade. That means we're both aging gracefully, but we're still. Wow, that feels like a long time ago. I've been incredibly lucky to spend the past 25 years or so working in politics and strategic communication, advising and running organizations, lobbying, working in senior staff positions in the House, in the Senate, and at the end of the Obama administration. And for a long time, I was an adjunct instructor in the School of Media and Public Affairs, which is when we met over at GW. Then in the fall of 2017, in part as a result of the election in the fall of 2016, I joined the faculty full-time as an associate professor and a practitioner in residence. So I teach 3 classes, but I also still do some advising and consulting on the side, more pro bono now, some paid, but helping organizations figure out some management issues, some strategic issues, some communications issues. And because of the season we're in, I'm also now helping some candidates and electoral organizations. So I've been exceptionally lucky.
So you're on a lot of Zoom calls. You're doing a lot of strategic framing and messaging work. That sounds exciting.
It is a lot of fun. There's a whole lot of Zoom. There's a lot of Zoom in everybody's life now, though. So.
Yeah. So what I wanted to get into today was framing, and it's obviously a really important concept in political communication. You're probably the first person who challenged me to think about framing really deeply. And I wanted to help differentiate for folks the difference between, framing as a structural strategic communications imperative versus, say, day-to-day messaging. We're not arguing over, tweaking which little words we use here and there. We're actually arguing about something that's a lot deeper when we talk about framing and political communication. So can you share with me your definition of framing that you use in your work and when you're teaching other people about this field?
Sure. Framing is one of these big issues that people sort of use loosely in kind of the same way, but not entirely. For me, framing means describing something from an interested angle. Part of framing for me is also that it's inevitable. The world is a big, complicated, confusing place, and we can't not pick an angle for it, right? When we see something, we don't pause and contemplate every possible thing it could be. We look at it and go, oh, this is one of those. And once we decide what the those is, what the it is about, what this thing looks like or is, then we decide how to respond to it, right? And so one example that you may remember from class, maybe not, is imagine there's a fire at night. A building is on fire at night. And as anyone who does or worked in television knows, if there's a fire at night, it wins, right? So the first news crew shows up on the scene. And it sets up across the street, and it gets the flames engulfing the building, lighting up the night sky. That's true. That's an angle, but it's also a frame because it includes the building and the fire, but it excludes all sorts of other things. The next TV crew shows up, and they think, well, we can't do the building burning because our competitor's doing that. So instead, they focus on the first responders and the firemen rushing in and out of the building with the masks and the tanks and these really sort of heroic things. That is also true, but it's also a different story. Third crew shows up and thinks, well, this is a drag. Now we've got to find something new to cover. So instead, they focus on a little girl crying, huddled, maybe being cared for by a police officer or a fireman and clutching a teddy bear. That is also true. But every single one of these is a different angle on the same story. It's a different frame. The first one, if I'm watching at home, I think, wow, that's dramatic. I better check my smoke detectors. The second one, I think, wow, that's really heroic. Our firefighters don't get enough respect, our first responders. And then maybe I go get my, NYPD hat or donate to the Fireman's Fund. And the third one is also true, but I'm not thinking about the building, right? And the third one, I'm focusing on the tragedy of this. Oh, I wonder who this kid's parents are. I wonder what happened. I hope there's enough toys. And you want to go by and send her a teddy bear. Right? So each of these is true, but we can't not pick one to focus on. Our brains aren't big enough to focus on all of them at once. So the frame is simply the about. Is it the building? Is it the firefighters? Is it the kid? Then if you're being strategic, if you're in the business that you and I are in, you want to pick the frame that's going to result in the policy angle you want most, right? So if you want people to care about children in distress, don't show them pictures of burning buildings. Show them pictures of children in distress. So it's that sort of thing.
Yeah, and you use the fire example, but I'm thinking about this in the context of all the recent news coming out of Portland and the protesters standing off against federal officers outside a federal building there, and it's really interesting to see how people who support the protesters are framing it and what videos they're highlighting versus what's getting highlighted from the administration and the Department of Homeland Security, and it's exactly that, right? It's images of these federal officers getting their orders for the day, and they're portrayed as very heroic versus, okay, here's a bunch of protesters setting a fire. Oh my God, this is chaos in the streets. We need these federal troops out here. It's all very strategic, and in that context, the framing is also it's actively competitive because you have people who want different sets of solutions. So that means they have to define the problem differently. So can you talk a little bit about how framing is competitive when there's an active fight over a policy issue?
Yeah, absolutely. First thing to remember, of course, is that framing is inevitable. Somebody's going to listen to this and think, well, if we just got away with spin and if everybody just told the truth, you can't. You can't not spin. People listening to this are saying, oh, this is a podcast about, and they've already defined who you are and who I am. They've already made up their mind. When thinking about the podcast, the listeners may be thinking about the content. They're not thinking about the tech, which is also important. They're not thinking about all the precious metals and minerals that go into building this technology and all the damage that does to the countries. They're not thinking about, you can't not come at something with a perspective. Mm-hmm. So if you're strategic about it, you want to pick a perspective that makes it more likely for you to win. There are a couple of researchers named Frank Baumgartner and Brian Jones, a couple of political scientists, who in an important book called Agendas and Instability in American Politics, point out that most political debates aren't is to, is not. Most political debates are, is this, it's that, right? If you're arguing about the facts of a case, the outcome of the case has probably already been decided because you get to pick which facts matter, right? And if you're picking, on the other hand, which frame, what's this about, then you're going to win everything else. So in Portland, if this is about failed leadership, anarchy in the streets, threats to American security and identity, rogue elements, chaos, then the only solution is law and order, right? Because in the face of chaos, most people don't think, cool, we should probably add gasoline. No, they think, oh, we should probably add cops, right? If, on the other hand, it's clamping down on, if it's framed as clamping down on free speech and free assembly, if it's federal government, then it's a constitutional issue. We have our First Amendment right to be a pain in the ass and unreasonable. If, on the other hand, it's about federal overreach, which is yet another way to do it, all right, sort of a libertarian perspective, if the mayor of Portland and if the governor of Oregon are blowing it, that's kind of their prerogative. The Constitution says so. The Constitution doesn't say states have control over everything not in the Constitution, except when we think it's inconvenient or the president has a better idea, right? It just says, look, you're in charge. Good luck, right? So if it's then it becomes a different issue. Right. And then it has to become let them burn it down if they want to burn it down. It's their house. Right. And then you kind of get a libertarian perspective versus sort of an authoritarian perspective versus sort of a little d democratic perspective. But that competitive frame determines everything else.
Yeah, and agendas and instability really stuck with me from the reading. I think I did the reading again when I guest lectured or stopped in on one of your classes. And, it really illustrates this stuff at a very substantive level. One of the examples that sticks with me from there was how the conceptions about tobacco changed over time and how advocates strategically moved tobacco from an agricultural issue to a public health issue. And that wasn't just strategic communications, messaging, media coverage. It was a whole shift. It shifted the venues in which we were having that policy debate at a literal level. Different federal agencies get involved. Different congressional committees get involved. And then even at the media level, different types of reporters and types of coverage gets involved. It doesn't become something that the Agriculture Committee deals with, that's only written up in the farm trade press and occasionally a business story in the mainstream press. It becomes a political issue. It becomes something that health and science reporters are writing about, and it becomes something that a whole host of different committees get involved in, the FDA, et cetera. So, strategic framing, it's also fundamentally about power in that way too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good example. I do this exercise in classes still. We quickly write down what's smoking about. And within a couple of minutes, we come up with 20, 25 things. And as you say, it's about agriculture. It's about small business. Think about who sells cigarettes. It's small independent convenience stores, which tend to be owned by first or second generation Americans, right? First rung on the economic ladder, piece of the American dream. It's about individual choice. It's about addiction. It's about multinational corporations. It's about. And as you say, if you can successfully pick if it's about small business and entrepreneurs, things run through the small business committee. It's a taxation issue. It's an American dream issue. It gets covered by, as you say, different media outlets, different reporters in different ways. If it's about killing kids, secondhand smoke, then it's the Senate Help Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. It's HHS, Health and Human Services, along with the Food and Drug Administration, possibly the Centers for Disease Control, NIDA, which is the addiction agency under HHS, and all sorts of others. And then it becomes about, and we don't think in our heads, we don't have this trade-off. Well, I've got 3 convenience stores, 4 sick children, and a farmer. I'm going to weight them all. We just don't do that. Instead, we say, oh my God, sick kids, stop. Right? And then everything else changes. Right? The messengers change, right? If it's about small business, if it's about entrepreneurs, I want somebody who's been a small business owner, or somebody whose kid just has a prestigious job, just graduated from law school, or is a strategic communications professional with a podcast or something, and say, I am here because my family was given a chance with the American dream. We worked hard, and one of the things we sold lottery tickets and cigarettes. And we didn't make anybody buy them. People came in, we met a need. And that allowed us to have a piece of the American dream. I want that message delivered by the son or the daughter of the person who started that business. I don't want that message delivered if that message is delivered by somebody in a lab coat, they have to say, my dad or my mom started this company, right? Then you change the messenger, right? If it's about sick kids, I don't want a convenience store owner saying, I have children, they are getting sick. That's too much to process. I want someone who looks like a pediatrician, right? I want a white lab coat with a stethoscope around the neck. Oh, a doctor. I'm going to listen to them. We see this with climate, an area far better than I do, is that some of the most trusted messengers on the impact of climate change are local weathermen and pediatricians. Because I get my local news from the weatherman who says, well, the storm's really bad and they're only going to get worse because the earth is heating up and the climate crisis means we can expect more of these. Oh, okay. Like our weatherman is wrong a whole lot, but we really invest a lot of trust in them. And the same with a pediatrician. Well, you've got to really be careful about tick checks because ticks are bigger and meaner and they live longer because of climate change. So you really have to watch out your son or your daughter isn't, at risk of Lyme disease. You've got to do serious, because of my pediatrician. If I said the same thing or you said the same thing, it simply wouldn't have the same credibility.
Yeah, that's actually a really good example of sort of frames that are viewed as politicized and non-politicized too, because the education of the broadcast meteorology community on climate took years. In some cases they were behind where climate scientists were at because climate and 30-year trend lines just really wasn't what they were concerned with day to day. And a lot of other people who work in both climate and meteorology just did a ton of deliberate education through their scientific societies. So, that meteorological coverage of climate change, integrating climate into weather reporting, that really changed over time. And that was because of these educational resources in the scientific community. But then from a political perspective, the Obama administration, when they released the second national climate assessment under their tenure in the White House, that was an audience that they spoke to immediately. They invited all these meteorologists to come to the White House lawn for like this big climate day. And that was an opportunity for the president to basically leap over the DC political press that was going to present this as, climate policy, Republicans versus Democrats, and say, actually, I want to talk to the meteorologist about how climate change is affecting you according to federal science here in your backyard. So it was a way to leapfrog and get to get to an area where people could approach it from a different frame and think about local impacts, and climate change is something that affects me and people like me, and not climate change is something that, people fight about in the Capitol.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And this, at a basic level, this comes down to, unsurprisingly, Aristotle. As you, I have to. As you may recall, Aristotle says every successful argument is something's persuasive if there's somebody whom it persuades, right? There's no persuasion in the abstract. You can't say I have a really persuasive argument. It just didn't convince anybody. It just doesn't make any sense in a sentence. But we say that all the time, right? Advocates say, well, clearly I need to say it louder and slower because obviously, no. About the person being persuaded,
if I can merely get my target audience to sit down in a room and let me lecture at them for an hour, I will persuade them so hard. Oh God,
if they're only as smart as I work, why then they would obviously do that. But we all know advocates who do this.
This is also, I should say, this is like endemic. Like, and I'm part wonk, right? Like I love wonkery too, but this is sort of endemic and like helping wonks frame their policy prescriptions for policymakers who just aren't wonking out all day, right? You have to adjust how people are thinking about who they're communicating to and what their baseline of understanding is.
Well, it's not just what their baseline of understanding is, but as Aristotle said, there are three elements to it: ethos, pathos, and logos. Logos are the data. Here are the scientific facts, right? To your climate versus weather example. Look, here are the long-term trends. These long-term trends affect local storms this year because of Y. And meteorologists will look at that and think, oh, okay, that's data-driven. I get that. I'm a data person. This is, being a meteorologist is hard. Then you have to have a bit of pathos to make it compelling, right? No one is ever persuaded by a spreadsheet. 11, did you see that? Holy cow. Look at that algorithm. I'm moving. No one ever does that. But what you do have to say is, here's what this means. Here's what this climate data indicates is weather means in your community. All of these homes along the coastline are going to be underwater in 10 years. Your home, your community, your kids, your schools. Let me tell you the story of one family that for generations has farmed right along the water's edge. They have to abandon their family farm because of these long-term trends. Now you've got a bit of a story, got a bit of appeal to emotion. Then critically, you have to have somebody whom the audience believes, right? And that's not you or me. That's the weatherman, that's the pediatrician, that's a local farmer going, look, the science stuff, the climate stuff, that feels like a lot of Washington people yelling at each other. I got to tell you, the storms are getting worse. My soil is getting more, isn't as robust. There's more salt in it. I just the weather's changing because the climate's changing, and that means my farm isn't as productive. So as a farmer, I can tell you, you're a farmer. Okay, now you're not a politician. You're not a scientist. You're not somebody trying to tell me I'm stupid or immoral, right? So it's the messenger, it's the data, and it's the story that ties it all together.
So I want to move on to how we think about these choices from an ethical perspective, and that this is something that you're working on very deliberately now, and I think is super interesting because we often look at political communication, very cynically, and I use the term cynical in more of a neutral way, right? Cynicism can be bad. Cynicism can also be hard-nosed and clear-eyed, and if you're fighting for truth and justice in the American way and really good policy outcomes, it's okay to be a little cynical. You want to win. So I wanted to start with the frogs, and we'll get into the frogs. But then I wanted to spend the bulk of our time on the work that you've done around the anti-death penalty movement, because I think that gets really to the heart of sort of abolition versus reform framing in a lot of the debates that we see now. Before we get into that, can you tell me about the frogs?
Sure. First, I have to say that I'm not sure I agree with you in cynicism. Sarah Isger, who's a conservative commentator, she is director of communications for Attorney General Jeff Sessions, is fond of saying, be skeptical but not cynical. So come at something with a skeptical lens, ask a lot of hard questions, but don't give up optimism or hope that good will out. So I'm going to go with that. I'm going to go with be skeptical but not cynical. So the frogs, the frogs is not my example. It comes from Kristen Grimm, who runs Spitfire Strategies. And the example she gives, as I recall, it's been a long, long time since I've heard this, is that there was in San Francisco, they wanted to expand a runway to bring in more planes, right? They wanted to just have more flights landing, more people coming and going. And a group of environmentalists said, we can't have that. because it'll endanger a frog, a very rare frog that lives here, right next to the airport, and we have to protect the frogs. And so a good strategic communicator would look at that and go, okay, so what else would it do? Not that many people care about frogs. One of the other things that happens with more planes is more passengers coming and going, which means more traffic. So I tell you what, to stop the runway expansion, which is really what you want to do, we're going to talk about traffic. And the local environmental group said, no, we have to talk about the frogs because we're protecting the frogs. So, well, no one's good. If it's frogs versus economic expansion, frogs lose. If it's traffic, the runway loses. And it was really, and finally the communicator, the advisor in this example said it's not about the frogs, right? You're choosing, yes, it's about the frogs. Yes, it's about traffic. Yes, it's about jobs. Yes, it's about pollution. Yes, it's about a gazillion other things. But if you want to win, you want to pick the thing that's going to persuade the people who need to be persuaded. And it's probably not protecting an endangered frog. It's probably stopping traffic.
Well, and that always struck me as something that is very smart and strategic. And, I remember you sharing that story when I was an undergrad and that, really clicked for me. And then, now I look at it 10 years later after a lot of work, with environmentalists and in the climate movement. And I think back on that story and think, well, if I had $1 billion, I could convince people to care about the frog. I could foster this intense environmental ethic. We could have this great educational campaign, and I could actually win this endangered species or threatened species debate on the frame of endangered and threatened species. And that might be better for me and my organization and my movement long term. But where do I get the $1 billion to launch this incredible campaign? So especially when we're facing resource constraints, when we're doing advocacy, all of a sudden you do start looking for these other hooks and these other ways to reframe and these other strategic ways that you can get in and get that win. But it doesn't necessarily help you with your long-term argument. So that's often a tension there with these debates, just because we're in this competitive environment already, and we have timelines around campaigns.
I think that's right, but I also am not sure it's entirely right. Steyer is a good example of all the money in the world can't make people care about the environment, right? So I'm like $1 billion, frogs, whatever. It's economic expansion, right? If you spent $1 billion giving everybody in San Francisco money, if you don't build a runway, I'll give everybody here $1,000. That might work.
UBI, but for not building a runway.
Right, exactly, right? They're offset costs or something. And even the frog isn't about the frog. I mean, there are people who they're frogophiles or something. But the frog is a proxy for environmental protection broadly, right? It stands in for, it's a keystone species maybe, or all species are sacred because the environment is sacred. Like the frog itself only matters in the broader context, right? And so $1 billion isn't going to get everybody to embrace the Gaia hypothesis.
Yeah, one especially if you have a counter mobilization movement, right, and it's competitive again. Yeah, and that's interesting too, because at least in that context, there's also it's an often unstated environmental value. David Brower used to talk about this, but even if you never have the ability to, say, visit a national park or commune with nature or whatever, there's value in knowing that it's there. Like there's value in knowing that there's these untouched places. There's value in knowing that there's these species out here who, have some fundamental right to exist too. Okay, but so moving on, one of the other examples that you used in class that I think was really interesting and that also stuck with me was the work that you did around the death penalty. And we set a little context for this earlier in the episode before you came on. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you got involved in this work and who you were working with, and just sort of start to set the scene for us.
Yeah, it's this is a long time in the rearview mirror. But I was the chief of staff in the House of Representatives. This is sort of instructive on this might go to the cynical rather than
was this your claim to fame for? Did you get to do the first website or one of the first websites?
I put the first member of Congress on the internet as a Gopher server, and that was in the early '90s. This was a different congressman years later. Although I recently I dug through the basement for stuff because we're in COVID, and at some point you're like, what to do? And I found an article from the Phoenix Gazette. I want to say it was an Arizona congressman. And my boss, Sam Coppersmith, was one of the first handful of members of Congress with email in 93, 94, something like that. And the article pointed out that between something like January and April, he'd received 104 email messages, which is roughly the number you will receive before noon today.
Right. It's amazing.
But anyway, so I was the chief of staff in the House, and I was kind of bored. We'd won a really tough campaign, and that was really fun. And governing at some point, I just don't find as interesting as running. So I called somebody and said, hey, I'm looking for something to do. And she said, there's this new group starting that wants to work on the death penalty. You should do that. Okay. And it wasn't a burning passion of mine, but I thought, sure, why not? And it was a brand new organization with a lot of resources that said, we're going to reinvent the death penalty debate. And up to that point, for several hundred years, in the death penalty debate in America had been about, on one hand, it's been about morality, whether or not anyone deserves to live or the state deserves to take their life. There have been arguments around deterrence. The deterrence argument fell flat on its face for a century. Early in the 20th century, there was a law journal article arguing that clearly the death penalty wasn't a deterrent because in Virginia, horse theft was a capital crime, but in Maryland, it was not. And yet there was more horse theft in Virginia. That's
just science. Can't argue with that. Horse thieves.
Just science. So, but it wasn't catching on, and so we did some polling and looked at a bunch of other stuff, and we decided that we wouldn't talk about the death penalty because the moment you said death penalty, everybody had an opinion. Roughly two-thirds of the people said, "Oh, you're one of those," and a third kind of thought, "Oh, well, you're one of those," and that was it. Nothing I could say was going to change your mind. So instead, we tapped into a different sort of set of values, sort of set of American values. And that's the idea that everyone deserves a fair day in court. We know it's not true. That's really been brought to the fore. Really, we've really been reminded of that in a big way in the past couple of months with the civil rights protests. But we want to believe that everybody in this country should be treated fairly. You get a fair shot. And we pointed out that more than 100 people have been sent to death row who didn't belong there. That lawyers slept through trials in Texas. In Georgia, one attorney referred to his own client with a racial epithet. The system just was, Jeez. We couldn't even get to the conversation about whether or not the death penalty itself was morally appropriate because the system itself was just operating so badly. And so what we needed to do was talk about ways to ensure, to build safeguards. Right, and we talked about fairness, and we talked about innocence, and this is when DNA testing became a thing, and Barry Scheck and the Innocence Project, a lot of which was coincidental. Like Barry's work was hitting the fore during the fray. Yeah, no, Barry happened to be doing this stuff when we happened to be doing our thing. There's a guy named Jim, spacing his last name, Coleman at Columbia, who happened to have been working on a long-term study on wrongful conviction rates, and he'd been working on it for ages. And he said, "Hey, I've got this new data set. Do you think it could be interesting?" And me and the comms consultant looked at him and went, "No, that's regression analysis. You can't." And it ended up on the cover of every major news magazine in the world. At my sister's wedding, I was on the phone arguing that no, Southern Time or Newsweek could not break our embargo and put it on their cover.
And what was the story?
It was the wrongful conviction rate. The roughly 1 in 10 people to death were sentenced wrongfully. So instead, we talked about a broken system, and in that context, death sentences began to decline. A number of states abolished the death penalty. A really telling example, as you said, of the competitive nature of these things came from a state legislator in Illinois, a Democrat, who ran for office supporting the death penalty and issued a 2-page press release. Illinois is one of the worst places for wrongful convictions. The Republican governor, suspended executions. It was just a hot mess in Illinois. And the state legislator put out a 2-page press release saying that she had supported the death penalty because it's the only appropriate response to some crimes, right? Raping and murdering children, for example. But she decided to come out in favor of abolishing the death penalty because the system was so flawed. The critical piece of that is she didn't change her mind.
Yep.
She changed her position, right? She changed the frame. she didn't say, I used to think the death penalty was morally appropriate. There's DNA testing, so now it is morally inappropriate. That just didn't happen.
Yeah. Boy, was I wrong. Gee, boy, were all of my moral presuppositions about the world incredibly mistaken. Yeah, never
Pauline
happens.
conversions happen rarely enough that we call them Pauline conversions. Right? St. Paul was a long time ago, and yet we still refer to them as Pauline conversions because rarely do people have them. Instead of changing our mind, we change our focus. Brian Jones wrote a terrific article called "A Change of Mind or a Change of Focus," where he basically measures. It's basically framing effects, and by talking about that frame, the innocence and fairness frame, death sentences just were driven way down. They've come back, unsurprisingly, very recently under this administration. But states abolished it. The Supreme Court issued several major rulings, making it more difficult to execute people. Frank Baumgartner and some other colleagues actually wrote a book-length case study about this, the discovery of innocence and the decline of the death penalty, where they just really heavily measure the effect of this new frame. And as you pointed out earlier, the reporters who cover it, where it shows up in the newspaper, where it shows up in the press, who the messengers are, all of that. And as an audience member, I don't have to think I am morally bankrupt and evil because I believe in this thing. I get to think of myself as heroic and just because I believe in a fair system.
Yes. I want to break that down a little bit. When I think about this debate from this era, and even, I mean, this came up in the War on Terror too. The folks who were speaking the most often about death penalty abolition and the immorality of the death penalty, it was priests, it was nuns, it was religious leaders making a really explicit moral argument. Was that the case at the time? Who spoke? Who were the spokespeople for the pure abolition position?
The abolition position was, this is a gross oversimplification, so if my friends are listening, understand it's a gross oversimplification. It was priests and hippies versus cops and victims. And cops and victims are more compelling. Well, what would you do if it were your daughter or your wife? Or let me tell you what I really see on the streets, and this is really tough. And then you bring up the example of a Jeffrey Dahmer. And there was always the Hitler question or the Bin Laden question or all of that. With a fairness.
Well, and this is important. If you invoke abolition, the people, your opponents, as well as I think just everyday people, even me, as someone who doesn't want the death penalty, I immediately start thinking of exceptions because you've given me 100% absolute. And the mind reels, and you're like, but what about, and that can put you in a very weak rhetorical position.
And it's a very dicey sort of intellectual position as well. Like it's a classic philosophical question. If you could go back in time, would you kill Hitler? Did Hitler deserve to live? And if not, did you deserve to kill him? Right. And then, we'll just save it for the worst of the worst. Okay, then where does that begin? And the worst for whom? And the worst by what standard? Because this is a going a political wayback machine. In a presidential debate in 1988, Mike Dukakis was called out for opposing the death penalty. Said, "What if it were your, wife or mother or something?" And Dukakis, his wife, and Dukakis gave a very Dukakis response, which was sort of measured and bureaucratic and all of that, as opposed to saying that, that would be really gut-wrenching and hard, and I would want to find that person myself with a tire iron, which is precisely why we shouldn't have the death penalty. Right? Right? But instead, so the debate was, and there were all these vigils, right? And I used to joke that we're not one candlelight vigil in the rain away from abolishing the death penalty. It's not, we're sing Kumbaya a little louder, and then the governor will get it. It's just not there. So instead, we went in with fairness. Then you begin to get governors. Then you get victim family members. And we did a lot of outreach to murder victim family members who, this doesn't provide closure. This doesn't do what you think it's going to do. And what if they get the wrong guy? They play the exonerated happened around the same time, which was they would get local elected officials or celebrities or whomever to read basically a play put together of real words of people who've been wrongfully sentenced to death, right? And now you're shifting the attention to those who are on death row who didn't belong to be there. People like Kirk Bloodsworth from Maryland, who's the first person who'd been sentenced to death in this country, who was later exonerated by DNA testing. And it was a shift of that messenger. It allowed all the rest of us to not, I didn't have to undergo a moral transformation.
Right.
I could instead hang on to and promote a different set of ethical values that I hold dear in this country, which is access to justice and fairness.
Yeah, and just to put a really fine point on it, if the conversation is now dominated by these stories of wrongful conviction and how bad the process is, if you're a death penalty defender, now you're on very weak ground, because now you're not arguing about exceptions anymore. You're arguing about a real life case. You're not having a thought experiment about hopping in the time machine to go kill Hitler. You're talking about a real person who was put on death row unjustly, and now you can't argue with that. And now you're in the position of having to argue for some perfect version of the death penalty that's never going to exist.
I knew that we had won when the head of the National District Attorneys Association said, not that many innocent people are sentenced to death.
Oh, God.
Right. And he's right. Right. As a statistical matter, it's just like the death penalty doesn't affect that many people directly. Right. It's just not. If you're going to fix the criminal justice system, why on earth would you do the thing that's used a handful of times for a handful of people in a handful of places once every couple of years? So but then like, okay, cool. So how many? Is it like 10? No, well, not 10, so 9. Please bring me that debate. I'll show you these 10 people who were exonerated from being on death row. Which one of them should have died? Please bring me that debate.
Well, it's funny because it takes a long way around, but it's still, that argument still gets to a core thing that I think proponents and opponents would both agree on, which is that it is the ultimate penalty and it cannot be taken back once someone is penalized. Right.
We were lobbying a Republican senator who was Mormon, and sitting in his office, and he just quoted the Book of Mormon. He said it's better to free 10 guilty men than let one innocent die, or something like that. But but there's a downside, right? When we promoted this gets to the ethics question. We were bankrolled. And we were not of the anti-death penalty movement, right? I was a political hack. I'd just come off the Hill. I'd worked in the House and the Senate at that point. I'd run some campaigns. And I hadn't been toiling in the fields of civil rights and social justice. And we were accused in print of, quote, cleaning the rope.
Wow.
We're going to make America safe for the death penalty. And some people who are leading abolitionists in the country now really didn't like me and really didn't like our organization. They thought we were playing badly. We were lobbyists. And that's it's a bad thing. I sat on a panel in a church, because that's where the political left meets, is in church basements. And I was the only person in the room in a suit, like just the entire one of the room. And the person chairing or presiding over the panel said, "We've even learned to embrace or love," or something like that, lobbyists. And everybody looked at me. Not the bad guy. And it's in talking about the importance of, we argue you couldn't fix the system, right? We were always very aware that what we didn't want to do is say, okay, the death penalty is okay now, go forth and execute, which is what happened between 1972 and 1976 with the Supreme Court. We always wanted to make it one repair away. Like a metaphor we used was, if you have an old car, and having owned a couple of old British sports cars, this really worked for me, at least. So, it's great. I'm going to just fix the brakes. And then the water pump goes, right? Oh, and then the radiator goes. And then the timing belt goes. And at some point you just push the car into the Potomac. So what we wanted to do was make America push the death penalty into the Potomac. Oh, just one more thing. The problem is, in doing that, you are not talking about race. And race in the death penalty gets complicated. More African Americans are sentenced to death, but more whites are executed. We are not talking about class, right? The standard line is that it's better to be rich and guilty than poor and innocent. We are not talking about the incarceral state.
Right.
We're not talking about this notion of punishment. We're not talking about prioritizing victims, right? You get sentenced to death for killing a young white girl. You don't get sentenced to death for killing a prostitute. Does that mean young white girls are more human? Their lives are more valuable? Like we just avoided all of those complicated questions. And by bringing cops and prosecutors along with us, which we eventually did in many cases, then we said, cops and prosecutors, we're now strengthening their hand, right? And the bill was federal legislation. We passed legislation in a bunch of states, and then federally, And part of the package that passed federally was more money for prosecutors, which I think, like, if you want better prosecutors, pay them more. It's really, please pay defense attorneys and prosecutors more money. But now you're like reinforcing the system which created the problem to begin with. And there's a real argument that we're seeing highlighted now with the Abolish the Police movement that you cannot expect the system which created the harm to then fix the harm. Right? And so there's a good argument to be made that we won in the short term, and we did, but at what cost? The trade-off was, well, we could continue talking about these hard conversations about race, about the inherent structures of unfairness in capitalism. You know, executions happen where there used to be a lot of lynchings. It is not a surprise that it's a lynching belt. We could have had that conversation. We could have spent the $1 billion on the frogs, and it might have eventually worked, but a lot of people would have been sentenced to death and executed in the meantime. And that was an ethical trade-off.
Yeah, and this is a really core tension, I think, in how work, in the sort of liberal, progressive, and left sphere gets funded, what gets prioritized, when somebody who's supporting a work is looking for a win. Is this a 1 year plan? Is this a legislative session? Is this a 2 or 5 year strategic plan? And it's rarer, at least in my experience, for an organization to look at a debate and say, we need to transform people's understanding of this debate over the course of a generation. That's often...
You've got short-term plans, right? So do I tell the person who's exonerated from death row, I'm sorry, you have to die. You're going to tell that person's mother, your son has to die because I have a long-term vision. I'm not going to have that conversation. How many people is it okay to execute wrongly so that your utopian vision can maybe come true in 30 years?
In thinking about how the community organized around these issues dealt with this framework of abolition versus reform, this is just an active debate among groups now in dealing with the police and dealing with ICE. I could probably even bring in some examples of how scientists view tobacco use in America too. There's still an abolition versus reform frame and how they want to do their work. But I'm really curious, how did everyone deal with that over this very long time period? Looking back on that debate and the resistance you saw initially, some of the policy victories that you helped secure over time, how did those inter-movement conversations around the frame and what was getting included or excluded, how did they change?
That's a good question. I ran an organization called the Justice Project, which was invented solely for this purpose, and the organization no longer exists. And we just didn't care because we had more money than anybody else. We were winning, and we were being run by political professionals and insiders. We hired top Democratic and Republican lobbyists, some of whom you see on TV now, and all of whose clients you've heard of and know. We hired top pollsters. And we just ran a political campaign, and we tried to play well with abolitionists, and we invited them to meetings. We go to their meetings, and we funded them a little bit. We funded organizations and people you've heard of. But ultimately, it was like, look, we're doing this. And we're going to try to, I get it. We're not going to fix the machine. Good insight. Thank you. But somebody said I was cleaning the rope in the press. Okay, well, we'll see how that goes. And I had one experience. I was in San Francisco at a meeting with a California high-profile anti-death penalty group in California. And the guy who ran it just hated me because for all the reasons people tend to hate people like me, plus me on top of that. There's a lot of reason for people to be angry. And I said, look, let's just get a drink. We're going to do the beer thing, right? We're going to do the Obama beer summit. And I said, look, I think we both want the same thing. We both want fewer executions. You want 0. I want 0, but 5 fewer is better. We can move in that direction. And I don't really care how we get there. I just want fewer people executed. And he said something like, no, we have to have a moral reckoning. Mm-hmm. All right, well, this conversation's basically over. Somebody else accused me of being a scab. I was running a national organization of murder victim family members who opposed the death penalty, and he didn't like how he'd been treated. And we went from talking about the Red Sox to him calling me a scab and my asking that we be able to talk about the Red Sox again. A lot of people then came around because we gambled, right? I mean, they could have been right. This wasn't a slam dunk. This was a shot. and it worked. And now you see a main staple of the death penalty abolition movement being highlighting innocence, highlighting stories of the innocent. But a lot of the people really promoting that idea today, effectively and passionately and successfully and brilliantly, did not embrace the idea initially. Winning tends to make friends, and we won, and we self-funded, and we raised a bunch of money. Right, we got the two largest foundation grants ever for anti-death penalty work to that point. So, money and victory tends to make friends.
And I would bring in what I think is a similar example here, which was the cap and trade fight over climate legislation in 09-10. And a lot of the mainstream green groups that had a ton of funding and, offices and armies of lobbyists in DC, well, fast forward, we lost the debate, right? We did not get national climate legislation. But one of the things that happened in the cap and trade fight was that environmental justice groups, people from communities of color that had been experiencing frontline pollution for generations, they felt totally excluded from this process. This was folks in DC seeing a window for a quick victory on climate legislation, lock it down. And, that it was tough because some members on the left who would normally be all about environmental protection were saying, look, environmental justice hasn't even been at the table here. Like, you have not talked to my people, you're steamrolling. The solution, it just will allow polluters to, pay for credits and offsets and keep polluting in our communities. We don't like this frame, this bad news. And I think as a result of that defeat, we've now seen over the past 10 years much more of an earnest effort, including an effort with, money and resources and attention to actually listen to the environmental justice community and co-develop policy that has more of a justice basis. And part of that conversation has led to, what is now the Green New Deal framework, which is a lot more dominant in the field. But I think this gets directly to your point about ethics and political communication. They're not just, tactical day-to-day decisions. They're really big decisions about what type of work we do and, who's going to come along for that work, short-term or long-term. And there's always trade-offs. And I think there's more consciousness now about what some of those trade-offs are. I think because people who work in a more, racial justice-oriented lens in this movement do have more of a voice now.
I think that's right, and it's the death penalty at some level is easy because nobody was thinking about it before about 1999, 2000. So we could sort of burst onto the scene. We've all been talking about climate now for decades at this point, and part of the ethic is who do you bring along, but it's also the success. Whose story do you tell? How do we make it real? The environmental movement has a serious privileged white guy problem. And a part of that is because they will fly into places and say, oh, look, there's environmental racism. Look at where all the pollution is, and then leave, right? I think electric cars are cool. There's a little mini electric roadster I keep wanting to come out. Electric cars pollute. They just don't pollute in the neighborhoods in which people who own them live.
Yep.
Right? That power is being generated, and it ain't being generated in the nice suburbs of Washington, D.C., right? You have to pay attention to that. But it's not, I think there's this artificial distinction, right? Between we can be just and pure and good, or we can be tactical, right? We can win or we can be right, but we can't be both. And I think that is wrong.
Okay, so I wanted to unpack that a little bit because often we have a meta-narrative around political communication that, doing the framing and being strategic, that's somehow like the dark arts, that we're giving up on, the good and pure and true message that can and should win over time. But in reality, these trade-offs are happening all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's really unfortunate. So often political communication, or what you and I do, is seen as the clever working on behalf of the smart. The smart people really know the answers, but not everybody can be convinced. So we've got to go to those clever people with their trickery and their special words, and maybe they'll, come up to the edge of the line of the law, and I think that's really unfair and not necessary. I think one can be effective, partisan, sharp-elbowed, clever, and ethical at the same time. Of course, it's difficult, but that's why they pay you. If we're easy, then everybody would be doing it.
Well, and I'll say some of the best work that I feel like I've ever done has just come from listening to field organizers and asking them to help me communicate more effectively with volunteers to get people to go sign up and knock doors and do really substantive on the ground political work. And that came from just a position of mutual respect of, you know how to get people to sign up and do things on the ground and go knock doors. I know how to write a good email and do a good narrative and framing around it. And that kind of collaboration with the quote real unquote political work, that's a lot of what digital organizing is. And that's a lot of what good strategy is to get people out in the field doing the thing.
But it's also respecting the people you're trying to persuade. Right. When I talk to a lot of organizations and consulting firms and stuff about ethical advocacy, and what I hear a lot is exactly what you just said. We have an ethical responsibility to those whom we represent. We have an ethical responsibility to our partners, to our funders, to our whatever. But they rarely talk about the ethical responsibility to the system or the political process in which they work, or to the people whom they're trying to persuade. And that's really much more my interest. Right? Yeah, treat your volunteers with respect. If you're a manager, treat your staff with respect. Like, that's just kind of good management. But you've also got to treat your voters with respect. And I think you also have to treat the democratic process with respect. I think we have an obligation to support a system of free and open dialogue. And that means not shutting that system down. Right? That means not attacking the pillars of that system.
And now you have a book on this very topic, political communications and ethics, theory and practice. Could you talk a little bit about that book? It's pretty unique in the field. I've not run into a book that has a title like this before.
It's not just pretty unique. It is, in fact, unique, unfortunately. It grew out of a need to have a textbook for a class I teach in the School of Media and Public Affairs called Political Communication Ethics. As you know, it's always been a part of what I've talked about when I've taught, but this is the first course I've fully taught on the topic. And so it's written as a textbook, but I think it has a wider appeal for anybody who works in or follows politics closely. Half the chapters are from academics, people writing about what one ought to do, starting with the pre-Socratics up through Machiavelli, then looking at digital politics, looking at civil rights actions in 1964, looking at speech writing, all of that. Then half the chapters are from political communications practitioners, some of whom are your classmates, in fact. There's somebody a School of Media and Public Affairs alum named Peter Loge, who is a Republican opposition researcher, writing about opposition research. Kip Wainscott, who's another SMPA alum and was very senior in the Obama administration, writes about the limits of legal ethics. Right, the law can tell us some of what to do, but it can't tell us all of how we ought to behave. There's a bipartisan lobbying team and others who write about not how ethics sort of ought to go in the abstract, or what Machiavelli or Isocrates or Protagoras suggested ought happen, but what ethics actually looks like on a Tuesday morning at 10 in a staff meeting. And it's I think it paints a really interesting and complicated picture of what all of us, what you and your friends and colleagues and my friends and colleagues try to do every day, which is just like do the best you can while recognizing that we're people and we have good days and bad days and stressors get high and it's the pandemic and oh my God, it's another Zoom call and I need to pick up my dry cleaning and that other stuff.
And long term, what do you hope to accomplish with this focus on ethics and political communication? Not just the book, but with the project on ethics and political communication at GWU.
So last March, I launched the project on ethics and political communication to promote the study, teaching, and practice of political communication ethics. I feel like it ought to be a thing. Ultimately, what I would like to have happen is everybody who majors, minors, gets a graduate degree or certificate, or takes a class in political communication, advocacy, speech writing, whatever, has to confront ethics. If you study journalism, law, medicine, public relations, you have to take classes in ethics, read about ethics, their books or conferences, and all of that. There really isn't that for political communication. And more people are doing what you did, which is get a degree in political communication. They ought to confront ethics. So that way, when you're out in the field, when you're doing the job you're doing, when you're in a coalition meeting on climate, something in the back of your head is saying, okay, we're not going to do this on a Friday afternoon because no one will see it. We have to make sure it's retweetable with an image. And how come there's only white kids in that picture?
Yep.
Right? That little ethical, it's not going to fix everything, right? It's not like I'm going to wave a magic wand and we're going to go back to happy dialogue with rainbows and puppies. But hopefully it'll be a little bit better. And our debates will be a little bit just qualitatively better and a little more ethical as a result.
Okay, so just wanted to wrap up here quickly. I always enjoy talking to Peter Loge. I always learn so much. And one thing I didn't realize that I thought was very interesting that didn't stick with me from my undergrad education was this idea that the framing choices we make, when you look back on them from a distance, even the successful ones, you just have no idea if they're going to work out at the time. And I thought it was very interesting that he said the abolition position absolutely could have worked out at that time. We just don't know. It wound up being that these process arguments and these fairness arguments wound up having a really big impact. And, when we look back on it, a lot of success. And we don't necessarily know if that'll be the case in these current debates now. And of course, the abolition position and the reform position, they interact with each other. These are active framing choices and active arguments that are happening out in the real world right now. And they're in tension with each other, but in a lot of ways, they also complement each other, right? If someone is going out there with a very strong abolition position, oftentimes the political leaders, the decision makers will have an incentive to adopt a reform position in response. So you also have a debate about whether or not that is diluting the power of an abolition movement. And that these are all active framing choices that absolutely have trade-offs, and we don't know what the future is going to be. So, there's absolutely some humility we should have here in confidently predicting where our politics are going to head. But it's also worth thinking about all of these choices as having trade-offs in one direction or the other. And if we think about them objectively, I think we can have a healthier, more open conversation about how some of this stuff plays out and what some of our own ideological predispositions are when we come into these conversations about political communication. So I wanted to do a couple quick plugs for Peter Loge and his work, Political Communication and Ethics Theory and Practice. That book will be out on August 6th. There's a launch event that I will link to in the show notes. You can follow him on Twitter at ploge. That will include hot takes on soccer. If you go to peterloge.com, you'll see another book he wrote, Soccer Thinking, which touches on soccer and management practices. So truly a polymath here. He's written about a lot of different fascinating things. If you want to follow more on political communication and ethics, you can follow at Polycom Ethics on Twitter, and that is more focused on what's coming out of that program at GWU. So I'll link to those in the show notes too. We'll be back with some more topics in the coming weeks. I'm looking forward to experimenting more with this project. And if you have other ideas, if you have other people who you think would be interesting guests in this program, other folks you'd like to hear from when it comes to how we think about political communication, how political arguments really work in practice, hit me up on Patreon or hit me up on Twitter. I would love to have them on Close Read. Thanks so much.